For the last 40 years, I've seen podcasting really evolve big time. I mean, at some point, podcasting will be more important or more powerful, if you will, than just a regular radio show. Okay, let me give you a first introduction here. When you think about podcasting business, you got to think about a niche that's constantly evolving. But it's not a niche by itself that's going to really let's say take care of your business in terms of the monetary aspect of things. You got to think about other ways to monetize your podcast. Otherwise, you're not going to survive in the long run. Okay, that's something I've seen the last 40 years. 30 years ago, 20 years ago, a lot of podcasters were really trying to really just survive based on one platform, but they couldn't really do it for a long time because they did not really diversify. You have to diversify. If you are a podcaster, you got to diversify. And this trend hasn't changed in the last 40 years, okay? And nowadays, it's just a lot easier to diversify than it was before. What do I mean by diversifying? Diversifying means that you're trying to make money from your fans. I mean, not make money from your fans. You're trying to monetize your fans. You're trying to offer value so that you can derive revenue. Besides advertising, you're deriving revenue from merch. You're deriving revenue from membership dues. You're deriving revenue from, let's say, sponsorships. Okay, that's really important. So in the last 40 years, that's what I've seen when it comes to podcasting. One thing for sure, if you try to really create the podcast, what has not changed is the plan that you have to really follow to do so. For instance, I've seen a lot of podcasters in the last 40 years brainstorm podcast topics, but not really choose the topic that really will resonate with their audience. That's a big no-no. You want to really choose a topic that will resonate with your audience. You want to decide on a podcast theme, whether you want to do a solo, conversational, or let's say group podcasting. Give your podcast a name. Write your podcast intro script. You want to get the right equipment and setup. Hire actually a musician to compose your podcast theme music if you are serious about scaling your podcast. Of course, you have free music, or you have a relative free music, but you also have a music that you can really let's say subscribe to and pay something every single month. Okay, but don't forget that collaboration is really going to carry your podcast really far. That's something I've seen the last 40 years. In the last 20 to 30 years, collaboration has been really on the rise. Okay. Also, advertising is also going to help you. Nowadays, it's just a lot easier to actually make money from advertising, but also advertise your own podcast in order to increase the visibility. So, in the last 40 years, what I've seen the podcasting business actually evolve from is actually, let's say, a foundation of amateurs. A lot of podcasters back in the days were amateurs, but nowadays podcasters are professionals. They're professional speakers. They're professional business people. They're professional. I mean, what I mean is they have a vision. You're not just podcasting for the sake of podcasting. You're podcasting with a vision in mind. Okay, so that's something that has already always been around for the last 40 years. In other words, when you're podcasting, you got to have a purpose and goals. Okay, and that's important because 20 years ago, I was really surprised when I saw a lot of podcasters really get into the game and they had no vision, but they were really to succeed because they had goals. They had no vision, but they had goals. Okay, so any successful podcast starts with a clear purpose and defined goals. Because the thing is that as the economy is going through ups and downs, and your audience is changing, or your audience is shifting their taste or their let's say their preferences, you got to have a goal yourself. Otherwise, you will be actually you'll have a wishy-washy podcast, what I call a wishy-washy podcast. So you always want to go back to your motivation. You want to understand your motivation. That's something that I've seen in the last 40 years. In the last 40 years, I've seen a lot of podcasters stick to their motivation. What's really driving them? Why are they podcasting in the first place? So ask yourself, why am I podcasting? Why do I want to engage in a conversation with my audience? And once you understand your motivation, you got to really attach to it measurable goals, okay? Because if you don't set measurable goals, you are going to really just You are going. Think about it. You have no GPS. The GPS is your measurable goals. The GPS is going to help you actually navigate through the itinerary of your podcast. That's important. Okay, so establishing goals with a specific timeline can make you larger objectives more manageable and achievable in, let's say, in a very efficient manner. What I've seen in the last 40 years of podcasting is that basically you've seen the emergence of something called the podcast script. Back in the days, back 20 years ago or 30 years ago, or even 40 years ago, a lot of podcasters were kind of similar to, let's say, radio show hosts. Okay. In other words, they had no scripts and they were just talking, let's say, they were improvising. Of course, they had a knowledge of the topic they want to talk about, but they had no script. Okay. Nowadays, the podcasting business is becoming so competitive. If you want to really stick to your plan, if you want to really, let's say, hook your audience right off the bat, you got to really think about having a podcast scripts. Okay, and the reason is that you do not want to babble on and on and on while you are on the mic. You want to go straight to the point because audiences nowadays have lots of possibilities, but they have lots of options, but they don't have a lot of time. It's always 24 hours in a day, but nowadays you have gazillions of options. So why should they pay attention to your podcast versus the podcast next door? What are you offering that's actually different from the others? Those are questions you need to think about. Okay, so you have a scripted podcast, you have ad lib podcast, you have hybrid podcast to really think about. So a polished and professional sounding podcast is kind of similar to what you might hear in a newscast or documentary. The script is written out and rehearsed before recording, and generally, this podcast may have particular themes that are explored in sequential order, demanding more structure and precision. Okay, and every episode is typically edited by a podcast editor or audio editor. So if you've got writer's block, get started with free podcast script templates. You have a lot of them. Let me know which one you want to try, and I'll just tell you where to go. You also have a ad lib podcast. So freestyle podcasts are more similar to live radio shows or television interviews. That's really what we had 20 years ago or 40 years ago. But in the last 15 years, you don't see those anymore. Okay. And you also have one thing I want to say here is that freestyle is an ad lib recording style that can become greatly successful with an engaging and charismatic voice. You also have a hybrid podcast. So aside from the introduction and the final closing remarks, it's rare that podcast episodes have a word for word script for the entire show. What I've seen in the last 40 years when it comes to the podcasting business is that the economy has really impacted the podcasting business a lot. Okay, like 20 years ago, 20 years ago, we had, 15 years ago rather, 15 years ago, we had the 2008 crisis. The depression, and it was pretty hard back then for a lot of podcasters to stick to their niche, if you will. Okay, you have to understand that when it comes to podcasting business, the podcast script has become very quintessential. Not only because of the changing economy, but also your audience or audiences in general have now shifting preferences. So when it comes to podcast scripts, the cool thing is you don't have to really, let's say, recreate everything. You can have a podcast script template. You have a lot of podcast platforms that have those templates, from Custos to Riverside to Spotify. I mean, you have a lot of tools out there. If you have a question, please let me know in the comment section, and I'll certainly direct you to the right resource this year for you to get the podcast script templates for you. So one thing you want to do here is that when it comes to the perfect podcast script template for you, what I've seen work out fine in the last 40 years is that you want to have the opening. So here you want to have a quick musical jingle or your brand's sonic logo. You want to have the introduction. So here you want to have a monologue style intro outlining your guest and what you plan to talk about on your show. You want to think about the segue. So this can be achieved using music or podcast sound effects or a vocal segue. So it's all about what works for your specific industry or what your audience is really expecting. So the topic one, you want to discuss the first topic for X number of minutes. It can be 10 minutes, it can be 15 minutes, it can be 20 minutes. And then you have a vocal segue. So we are going to move on and talk about blah, 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 or in other news this week, blah, blah, blah. Then you have topic number two. So you discuss the next topic for another 10, 15, or 20 minutes. Okay. And then you have ad insertion. This is the moment to insert a sponsored message or a podcast advertisement. It can be a pre-recorded or it can be pre-recorded and inserted in post-production. Think radio commercial break. Or you can speak about the sponsor in a conversational style that doesn't feel like a commercial break. So it really depends on what you want to really go for. Then you have the segue number two. And then you have the third topic. You can say you can discuss this topic for 10, 15, or 20 minutes. And then the closing remarks. Thank your listeners and your guests, then provide a sneak peek of what will be discussed on the next show. And then you have the closing musical jingle. One thing I've seen in the last 40 years is that basically a podcast introduction script has become very quintessential. In other words, you are trying to hook listeners right off the bat. Okay, it's one of those things where you have to pay attention to what's really happening and what's not happening. And in the last 40 years, also, one thing I've seen is that podcast listeners have become global. In other words, you can have someone in Jakarta, Indonesia, or someone in Abuja, Nigeria, and that person can listen to a podcast in the States. You know, like a podcast made by someone who is in the States. So geographic boundaries are no longer important. Okay, so the scripts becomes quintessential because basically that's the way you engage with the audience. Okay, and so what you want to include in your intro, you want to really include stuff that will hook your listeners right off the bat. So you want to consider the intro format that will bring each new podcast episodes to your listeners in a very conversational but also attractive manner. It's best to keep it short, say 15 or 10 seconds maximum. That way, the podcast intro will not be skipped over with the 30 plus skip setting on most podcast players. That's something I've seen also in the last 40 years. A lot of podcast platforms have skip setting let's say features that allow listeners to be more independent in terms of listenership. Okay, let me give you a few tips on things to include in your podcast intro. Give your listeners the number one coolest thing happening in the show and the lesson or takeaway that comes from it as a result. If you have an exciting and juicy tidbit to share in your final segment, make sure to reveal it right away to grab the attention of your target audience and keep them engaged until the end, or at least encourage them to fast forward to the part that intrigues them the most. And you want to play your intro jingle at this point to signal that the show is getting started, right? So the bottom line here is that in the last 40, 30, or even 20 years, I've seen that you are able to create momentum with your podcast script right off the bat, because you want to keep your audience engaged by maintaining a lively and varied flow of topics, whether in a lengthy discussion or a short program. One thing I've seen in the last 20 years, and that has been even bigger during COVID, is that basically you are able to structure and script your podcast segments in a way that really hooks your audience, not only right off the bat, but also at regular intervals. So if you want to really hook your audience at regular intervals, you got to really understand that there are several podcast segments to really think about. You got to think about the first podcast segments. the subsequent podcast segments, podcast interview formats, and also you need to have a podcast, an outro podcast script. What I'm trying to say is in the last 40 years, podcasting has become very structured. It's not just about you getting on the mic and trying to improvise. No, you want to really do some preparation before so that your audience is not really feeling bored. Okay. So when I think about the podcast segment, the first podcast segment, this is where you want to sustain listeners' attention. This segment should appeal to the entire audience. Broad content is encouraged to serve the majority. For example, news and current events related to your podcast subject matter are often of interest to an entire audience. You also have the subsequent podcast segments. So here you can discuss more in-depth topics and focus on specific areas of interest. So depending on your comfort level, you can fully script these segments to make sure you are speaking to them exactly as you want, or you can make yourself a set of bullet points to speak to in a more conversational or free-flowing style. So that's kind of cool from let's say from a communication point of view. You also have a lot of podcast interview formats. That's something I've seen also in the last 40 years in terms of scalability. So you want to really pay attention to the fact that interview styles have changed a lot in the last 20 to 30 years. So being a good interviewer and having an interview style is an art form in itself. So conducting a successful interview also requires mastering certain techniques like building rapport and trust with a guest, active listening, asking open-ended questions, utilizing follow-up questions, and asking for clarification. Nowadays, guests are willing to have a conversation with you, like a real conversation. They could be guests on your show, but if you want to really engage them, they are willing to engage you too. It has to be a mutually beneficial relationship. In the last 40 years, what I've seen in podcasting is the fact that basically listeners are becoming more a part of the show as they were before. Before they were just pure listeners. Nowadays, you want to engage your listener so that you can really have a more a livelier show. Okay, so get listener feedback as part of your podcast plan. You can also get podcast. You can get listener involvement as well. So once you have created your podcast, you can get the word out. So implementing a marketing and promotional strategy is kind of crucial to attracting a larger audience and growing the podcast. Utilizing social media platforms and actively engaging with followers can really enhance listener involvement and promote continued community growth. Okay, you can go on social media platforms such as Twitter, now called X, YouTube. For YouTube, you want to really have maybe YouTube Shorts. So those are for teasers. You can have Facebook Reels, Instagram Reels, and so on and so forth. So once you have a listening audience, encouraging listeners to leave reviews and ratings for your podcast is another effective strategy that has really that has been very, very prominent in the last 10 years, last 10 to 20 years, since the internet became such a quote unquote sensation. So if you're asking for ratings and reviews, please include clear calls to action in podcast episodes, websites, and social media. So offering rewards for leaving reviews, such as shout outs during episodes, can incentivize listeners to engage with the review process. They may even introduce new ideas that will give you an edge over competitors and enhance the listening experience. Okay. You have to trust your listeners. They know what's good for them, they know what's good for your show. The suggestion they actually shared with you could include segment duration, topics covered, guests featured, and more. And please be very careful when listening to listener feedback and make sure that you are taking them into account. Okay. And if you want to create a podcast schedule, group recordings, segment tasks, plan for operational tasks, set release dates, and use automation tools, make sure to inform your audience about the schedule for increased engagement. So here's a quote to this conversation. I'll share with you 40 years of podcasting business knowledge in 20 minutes. I spoke about what happened in the economy, what happens in the use of the internet, the use of internet for podcasting, but also the importance of engaging with the audience. Thank you so much. God bless you. I will see you next time. Until then, remember, stay marvelous.